Battle in the US-China trade war has begun. China announced it will impose 25% tariffs on US goods worth $16 billion in response to the US's latest round. But what does this escalation mean for the two economies, and what can we expect next? And US-Turkey relations are facing a rapid rupture. What's behind this latest rift, and what would a deeper deterioration of ties mean for the two NATO allies? Welcome to The Point, live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. Tit-for-tat, China announced it will impose additional tariffs of 25% on $16 billion worth of products imported from America, according to an official statement released Wednesday. Approved by the Customs Tariff Commission of the State Council, the new list of products includes 333 categories of goods, rising from 114 in the June draft. Items range from wood and oil products, metal scraps, to various types of bicycles and cars. The duties will take effect at 12:01 on August the 23rd, in sync with the U.S. tariffs. The spokesperson from the Ministry of Commerce said that it is totally unreasonable for the U.S. to put domestic laws above international laws. Again, to defend its legitimate rights and interests, as well as the multilateral trade system, China was forced to take necessary countermeasures, the spokesperson added. However, China's foreign trade has maintained steady growth in the first 7 months of this year. So what's ahead for China's economy? What impact have these tit-for-tat actions already had on China and the U.S. economy and world trade in general? How can we understand the categories of goods selected by both sides? Joining me for the discussion in the Beijing studio is Charles Liu, founder of How Capital, and in Washington, D.C., Robert Moran, partner at the Brunswick Insight. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Mr. Moran, let me go to you first. Now, the first batch of Trump's tariffs has been in place for a month. How has the U.S. market and economy been impacted? Are the tariffs working as Trump was hoping?
I think it's hard to tell at this point. I'm of the persuasion that no one wins a trade war. We have a lot of polling in the United States on American attitudes about tariffs and trade, and we know that 6% of Americans say that this has hurt their personal financial situation, that increasing tariffs and these tariff rate changes have hurt their personal financial situation. I'm sorry, 6% say it's helped, and 17% say it's hurt. So 6% say it's helped them, 17% say it's hurt them, 8% say it's helped their business, 17% say it's hurt their employer. And we'll see how this evolves over time. The U.S. economy is in good shape now, but we'll see what happens when these start to bite. U.S. public opinion on tariffs generally is quite split. 41% think the Trump tariff actions and Trump's stance towards trade is a change for the better, and 42% say it's a change for the worse. 49% think that trade war is bad, and 40% think it could be good. So American public opinion is quite split. With all that said, the Secretary of Commerce, in comments at the press club, believes that a trade war is winnable from the U.S. perspective. So we'll have to see.
Well, from what you have said so far, actually, I would say more people are against or hurt by these tariffs than people who are for or think that the tariffs have done them some good, although the margin is very small at this particular moment. Mr. Liu, analysts are mixed on whether tariffs have forced multinationals to rethink their supply chains and to start moving them away from China. Some believe China has avoided hitting the impacts that feed its foreign-owned factories, and that when the next round of tariffs hits, American households will face higher prices on computers, clothing, and thousands of other products. How will this 16 billion tariffs impact China's standing in the world as a manufacturer, if at all?
I think at least at this point there wouldn't be much impact at all, because no one knows what the next step of the Trump administration will be. He could very well just declare victory. I've won, and that's it. And then any attempt to move or change the supply chain will become a wasted investment. This is the part that is the most difficult for most companies. There's no clarity as to where it's headed. There doesn't seem to be a coherent strategy as to where it's going. So I think right now the tariffs are not going to impact the economies on either side significantly because, first of all, the dollar has been very, very strong, so RMB has depreciated somewhat. And secondly, I think the amount covered is actually minuscule in both economies. But for business people like ourselves, the problem is, what do you do next? How can you move the supply chain when you don't know what it will be 6 months from now or 9 months from now?
That's indeed a very difficult question to answer. But for the moment, let's look at what the tool is in the hands of the United States and in what China has announced as a retaliatory list. Now, Wednesday's list has been adjusted, as I said, after taking into account the advice of related government departments, industry associations and enterprises to best protect the interest of domestic consumers and company. One change is that, Mr. Liu, crude oil is now off the list. But U.S. crude oil prices has been dropping. So first of all, explain to us, what is the consideration of China removing crude oil from the list for now? And is there a danger that it could be back on the list sometime in the future?
I think crude oil, given the amount of trading that takes place worldwide in crude oil, whether or not you add or the Chinese supply from the U.S. or not have it is not very significant, because crude oil is a hugely traded commodity. So I think if the impact is not going to be very big, there's no reason to use it as one of your tools. But natural gas is a different story.
Right. Mr. Moran, U.S. crude oil price has been dropping, however, prior to and following the announcement by the Chinese side. What could be the reasons behind the drop? Do we know?
I don't think we know yet. I don't think we have enough time series data to have a good analysis of some of the impacts here. I think it's too early to tell. I think our other guest here made a great point, which is that most energy is traded in a global system, in a global market, and is very movable. So I'm not sure we know those impacts. There's a global market for most of these commodities. I do think that you're going to see some impacts in the next couple months. They should start to trickle through into the pocketbooks of consumers. The scope of that, I think, is difficult to tell. The challenge here is that Trump trade policies could be very unpopular in some corners of America and with some business groups, and very popular in others. It's probably bad economics, it's probably bad national politics, but it's probably very good local politics for him when you think about how he's trying to piece together a coalition to gain re-election in the U.S. Electoral College. So some of these actions may be popular in states like Pennsylvania or in steel country in Ohio and things like this, but may be very unpopular in other coastal areas or areas that are producing, goods that are heavily exported to the United States. Or it could be challenging for him in some agricultural areas, depending on what happens. So the problem here is just that both countries are so large, and the impacts are felt in very narrow ranges in different parts of each country.
The new round of U.S. tariffs targets 279 product lines, mainly chemicals and electronic parts. The U.S. Trade Representative's Office removed 5 items from the original list after a 46-day public comment and review period. The items removed include, for instance, containers, which the office says greatly harm the economy. So, Mr. Moran, can you understand the rationale why, and whether this is a sensible decision as well by the U.S. Trade Representative Office?
Well, it is interesting. I listened to the Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross, lay out in great detail his views on this exact subject at the National Press Club in Washington, just a few streets from where I am now. And it was very clear that he had his team go product by product and look at where they thought U.S. Manufacturers and U.S. producers were being disadvantaged and where they thought available pressure points were, and it was a highly targeted list. The challenge, I think, in all this is that so many of these products are inputs into something else, or they're highly valuable for a very niche purpose, and there may not be a readily available substitute at that moment. And so much of his discussion, in fact, at the press club was an analysis of Chinese available substitutes. It's fascinating. It was fascinating to listen talk about this, because obviously, if you start a trade war and you reduce the supply of different things, and this is you're talking about containers, but if you don't have a readily available substitute and you don't have a supply chain to back that substitute, then you're out of luck, right? And that may be the thinking here. On the other hand, there was clearly a view from the Commerce Department that China would not have readily available substitutes on some agricultural commodities, and Brazil would not be able to increase production rapidly enough to offset restriction from the United States.
It is interesting, however, that some of the products that are believed to be difficult to find substitutes are removed from the list, such as container. However, some other products, which is of similar situation, for instance, electronic cigarettes, are kept on that list, and basically the great majority of electronic cigarettes and coming from China with Chinese patents. So it's beyond us. What is the reason? Is it the difference in lobbying power? Anyway, as I promised, let's take a look at China's trade figure very briefly, Mr. Liu. China July trade data was under the spotlight as it was the first reading since fresh U.S. tariffs, and in July China's exports rose by 6%, a reading that beat market expectations. So what factors have contributed to this better than expected growth? Also, we are also seeing a more balanced growth, meaning the difference between import and exports to China is also considerably smaller than previous year. What are behind these?
Well, I think first and foremost, the July figures don't really indicate that much. As Mr. Moran has said, it would take some while for this to sink in, especially with a lot of preemptive buying. If I were going to buy things and tariffs are going to kick in, then I do what I can and buy first, because the storage cost is less than the tariffs. But I think even more important in terms of the balance side is China has reduced tariffs on many products in the last 2 months. In addition, the global economy has been quite healthy, so there has been significant growth in trade, which is a positive thing.
So it's not because of President Trump's measures that we are seeing what he wanted happening, Mr. Liu, in one word?
Not at all.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Many thanks to my two guests in Beijing, Charles Liu, founder of How Capital, and in Washington, D.C., Robert Moran, partner at the Brunswick Insight. You have been watching The Point with me, Li Xin. We'll take a short break, and when we come back, U.S. and Turkey are locked in a standoff over the release of an American pastor. Can the Turkish delegation in Washington, D.C. break the impasse? Stay with us. U.S. and Turkey are facing fresh turmoil, with officials from both sides meeting in Washington this week to try and tame the turbulence. At the center of this most recent storm appears to be the American evangelical Christian pastor Andrew Bronson, who was detained by the Turkish government in October 2016 on charges of espionage and involvement in a failed coup. U.S. President Trump demanded the pastor's release in a July 26 tweet, threatening Turkey with large sanctions. Now, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan rejected the U.S. demand, saying His government won't back down and is willing to go its own way. The Trump administration imposed financial sanctions against 2 ministers of Erdogan's cabinet last week, with threats of more sanctions to come. That has sent the Turkish lira plummeting and raised economic concerns. Meanwhile, Erdogan retaliated 3 days later with sanctions against his ministers' American counterparts. So what has led to this spiraling standoff? What would greater U.S. sanctions on Turkey mean for the 2 NATO allies? Joining me for the discussion are Professor Tugrul Keskin, Director of the Center for Global Governance and member of the Center for Turkish Studies at Shanghai University, currently joining us from Istanbul, and from Washington, D.C., Dr. Richard Weitz, Director and Senior Fellow at the Center for Political Military Analysis at the Hudson Institute. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. Dr. Weitz, let me go to you first. What do you think sparked this most recent round of tensions? Why has the American pastor become the centerpiece or catalyst for this latest escalation? Or, in other words, why the obsession by the U.S. administration?
Yes, it's I mean, as you correctly noted, there are many sources of tension in the relationship, though at the moment the focus is on the American pastor. That appears to result from Vice President Pence made a speech citing what's been happening to him. He was released to house arrest, and the Americans thought he would be freed, and threatened sanctions, and Trump immediately responded. So it appears to be that there's been a lot of tension focused on him, and people have speculated, and the 2 most plausible reasons are: one, according to a Turkish journalist, there was supposedly a deal for his release in exchange for some relaxation on fines on a Turkish bank that has been found to have evaded U.S. sanctions on Iran, and the Israelis were going to release somebody. When that fell through, Trump blamed Erdogan, and that's why you see the severe response. And the other interpretation is that with the U.S. congressional elections approaching, this was a case that was of great concern to the American evangelical community, and so this was a means to rally that group behind Trump, behind the Republicans.
Professor Keskin, let me go to you. What is the context of U.S.-Turkey relations before the Brunswick case was raised? I mean, we understand that Turkey has been asking the U.S. to extradite Fethullah Gulen, whom it accuses of being behind a failed coup in 2016, but without much success.
Yeah, from my own perspective, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to the show. I think this issue, the conflict between, or negotiation has been taking place between the United States and Turkey, is more complicated than the, this evangelical Christian priest, basically Craig Brunson. It is more complicated than the, this one man. The reason is not just about the Fethullah Gulen movement, but it's a deeper issue between the United States and Turkey, which is based on the Kurdish conflict, actually. U.S. support to Kurdish groups in northern Syria and northern Iraq created unintended consequences in the Turkish political circles, especially among the bureaucrats, among the political leadership, among the military leadership, basically. This has been an unspoken conflict between Turkey and the United States, just came out last few years, basically. And Gulen issue is behind this, basically. Gulen issue is probably result of the Kurdish conflict, or Brunson arrest is a result of the Kurdish conflict. Therefore, negotiation has been taking place today in Washington, D.C. between high-level Turkish and American diplomats.
Yeah.
But most importantly, this issue somehow related with China as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we'll talk about that in just a moment. Let's talk about the immediate sanctions. Again, to Professor Keskin. Now, to follow through with his threats, President Trump put these sanctions on the Minister of Justice and the Minister of Interior, and Erdogan called these steps not suitable for a strategic partner and disrespectful for Turkey, while the Turkish Foreign Ministry called the sanctions a disrespectful intervention in our legal system that would hurt the constructive efforts toward resolving problems between the two countries. Professor Keskin, how damaging are these sanctions, both symbolically and in substance?
Probably the negotiation has been taking place now between high-level U.S. and Turkish bureaucrats. Basically, I think they will solve the issue between, at least in the short term, they will try to find a solution for the, short-term solution for the problems between United States and Turkey. But in the longer term, U.S. support for the Kurdish guerrillas in Syria and Iraq, this has been very damaging for the Turkish-American relations. This is one of the most important turning points for the Turkish politicians, bureaucrats, and military officials in Turkey.
Right.
Gulen issue is, from my own perspective, is not as important as the Kurdish conflict.
Okay.
Especially U.S. support for the Kurdish conflict and
Sure.
Kurdish groups in northern Syria.
Okay. Dr. Weitz, the U.S. side seems to see sanctions as the most effective option to get what it wants, be it Turkey, be it Russia, be it Iran, be it China. Is it really the same case here, you think?
You are correct that both the Obama administration and now the current administration sees sanctions as a very useful tool. And you can understand why in general. I mean, the previous U.S. policy of invading countries and occupying them was just very costly. An alternative policy of not doing anything was too weak. And the economic sanctions tend to try and exploit the basis of U.S. economic strength, the centrality of the dollar. Often, in the case of Iran or Turkey, they can be effective in denying that country a lot of foreign economic exchanges. Case of China and Russia, less so because of the large size of their economies and so on. Now, what they've done here, though, is I understand why the media and the Turkish government is using the word disrespectful, because these sanctions aren't really going to hurt the aren't directly aimed at the Turkish economy, although it appears that this is contributing to the current economic problems, follow the lira and so on. They're mainly applied to individuals that are seen as people who violate international law, international human rights. They're put on this Global Magnitsky Act, which is basically was applied to Russia and now applied universally for people who are considered to be odious, and so I could see why this would really sting people who are affected, even if these people don't do business with the U.S. Whether this will have much of an impact, I tend to agree with our colleague in Istanbul that will probably, as we've seen in the past, when a few months ago when we suspended visas, or even going back to some of the earlier conflicts with the Kurds over Iraq and Syria, we will probably finesse this again. But the long-range trajectory of Turkish-U.S. relationship is very problematic. I mean, Turkey and the U.S., particularly under the current administration, have pursuing very independent foreign policies, and you can just see these tensions. And this was different than what it looked like when Trump was elected. He was very pro-Erdogan. His designated national security advisor was writing articles accusing Gulen of being a terrorist and so on. But as with many cases, what initial Trump policies were and how rapidly they changed was surprising to us.
Well, Professor Keskin, now U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo told his Turkish counterpart in Singapore just days ago, he said that clock had run out and it was time for Pastor Bronson to be returned. However, he also talked about Turkey's membership to NATO, saying Turkey is a NATO partner with whom the U.S. has every intention to continue to work with cooperatively. So what does that say about Turkey's importance to the U.S. as a NATO ally? Does the U.S. understand what it's doing?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you know, I am a realist in this, in the context of the international relations. U.S. needs Turkey as much as Turkey needs U.S. U.S. needs Turkey for the regional realignment. U.S. needs Turkey for the, you know, the Chinese foreign policy on China. U.S. needs some Middle Eastern allies containment for the containment of the China. Therefore, Turkey is a very important country for the United States and for the NATO. And it's similar to, you know, what's happening in today, basically. United States is trying to, you know, negotiate with the Turkey in the context of the regional alignment and trying to impose its own foreign policy objectives towards on Turkey and for the containment of China in the future, basically.
Yeah. Well,
which is directly related with
Professor
Iran
Keskin,
sanctions
let me interrupt you.
Today, basically.
Yeah, Professor Keskin, I have very little time left, but I do want to hear from you. What do you say the relevance with China in the relationship between Turkey and the United States? We understand Erdogan unveiled what he called a China action plan. What does that have to do with China? Very briefly, please.
I couldn't hear.
Yeah, well, Erdogan unveiled a China action plan.
Hello?
Yes, do you hear me still?
Hello?
Do you want to talk about the China action plan, or maybe not, because we don't have really any time left? I'm afraid we have to leave it there, but many thanks to my two guests. Unfortunately, because of technical problem, we're not going to have the answer for the last question, but we will talk about it in the future. Professor Tugrul Keskin, Director of the Center for Global Governance and member of the Center for Turkish Studies at Shanghai University, joining us from Istanbul, and Dr. Richard White, Director and Senior Fellow at the Center for Political Military Analysis at the Hudson Institute. Thank you very much for joining us for this edition of The Point. As usual, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with Alex. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.